I still hear it when the room goes too quiet. That sharp, crystalline crack, the sound of a glass striking marble, and exploding into 100 glittering fragments across a ballroom floor. For a single suspended moment, every conversation in that vast, chandelier-lit room went silent at once, as if the world itself had pressed pause. I was holding a silver tray. My sleeve had ridden up my forearm, and one of the most powerful men in Europe was staring at my wrist like he'd just seen someone rise from the dead. His glass had slipped from his fingers. It lay shattered at his feet. The entire room stood frozen, hundreds of guests in evening gowns and tailored suits, all of them holding their breath without quite knowing why. Security personnel shifted instinctively but didn't move. Nobody moved. The only thing moving in that entire ballroom was the king's gaze, traveling from the pale crescent scar on my wrist, up my arm, and directly into my eyes. His face had gone the color of chalk. That scar. His voice came out barely above a whisper, fragile in a way that seemed impossible for a man of his stature. Then he asked me something no stranger had ever asked me before, something that seemed impossibly formal given the circumstances, given that I was a volunteer server holding a water tray and he was a king. "What is your full name?" I had absolutely no idea, standing in that ballroom with hundreds of eyes on me, that the answer I gave would begin the unraveling of a 30-year deception. I didn't know that the people who had raised me had constructed their entire lives on a stolen secret. And I certainly couldn't have imagined that before the year was out, the family that had spent 3 decades reminding me how lucky I was to have them would find themselves exposed before the world. My name is Nora Callahan, or at least, that is what I was told it was. For 30 years, that name was the first and last thing I knew about myself with any certainty. I wore it the way you wear something that almost fits, close enough that nobody questions it, uncomfortable enough that you're always quietly aware of the seam. What I didn't know, what nobody had ever told me, was that the name itself was part of the lie. And that the lie had been running for 3 decades, carefully maintained, quietly profitable, and protected by the one thing that makes deception easiest to sustain: the refusal of everyone around you to ask the obvious questions. For 30 years, I was the family burden wearing a human face. The Callahans were the kind of people small towns build monuments to. Gerald and Helen Callahan attended every church service, organized every community fundraiser, and smiled broadly in every photograph. When neighbors gathered for summer cookouts or holiday charity drives, their names came up the way saints' names do, with reverence, with warmth. Gerald coached youth baseball. Helen organized the food pantry. They were, by every public measure, good and generous people. The cornerstone of their reputation was me. "We took Nora in when she was just a baby," Helen would say whenever my name entered a conversation. She delivered those words with a particular kind of practiced sadness, the kind that invites admiration rather than questions. And people always obliged. They nodded. They praised her. They told her she was remarkable. Nobody thought to ask what happened to me after the taking in was done. Because being taken in and being loved are entirely separate experiences, and I learned the distance between them very early. The Callahan house sat on a generous lot outside Peoria, Illinois, surrounded by old maple trees and carefully kept hedgerows. From the road it looked idyllic, the kind of place you'd photograph for a greeting card. Inside, the house ran on a very particular economy. Gerald and Helen had 2 biological children. Their son, Daniel, was 3 years my senior. Their daughter, Piper, was 2 years younger than me. Both had real bedrooms with curtains they chose themselves. Both had birthday celebrations with cake and candles and wrapped gifts. Both had clothing allowances, summer vacations, and the comfortable assumption that their futures were worth investing in. I had a different role. By 10 years old, I was preparing breakfast before school every morning. By 12, I was managing the laundry for 5 people. By 14, I had inherited the full roster of household maintenance, bathrooms, lawn care, grocery runs, alongside hours spent working in the family's hardware supply business after school. When I expressed frustration, Helen's response was swift and immovable. "You should be grateful." "For what?" I once made the mistake of asking. She looked at me as if I'd said something obscene. "For everything," she said. I never asked again. I learned instead to swallow questions whole, to fold them away somewhere interior where they couldn't cause trouble. That became my greatest survival skill, the ability to go quiet, to make myself small, to need nothing visibly. The older I grew, the sharper the contrasts became. When Daniel turned 16, Gerald handed him the keys to a truck. When I turned 16, I was given an expanded chore schedule. When Piper wanted to attend a summer theater program, Helen wrote the check without a second thought. When I asked about enrolling in community college classes, Gerald laughed in a way that wasn't unkind so much as dismissive, the laugh of a man explaining something obvious to someone slow. "Somebody has to keep this place running," he said. I understood what he meant. That somebody had always been me. The worst part was never the labor. Hard work doesn't break people. I know that now more than I did then. The thing that accumulated inside me like sediment, quiet and heavy over the years, was the story. The story they told about me, constantly, at every family gathering and church picnic and holiday table, the story in which they were heroes and I was their good deed made flesh. "We rescued her." Those 3 words followed me everywhere. Guests would look at me with a particular expression, admiring me the way you admire a stray that's been rehabilitated, and say things like, "Aren't you the lucky one?" I always smiled back. It seemed easier than explaining that I slept in what had once been a utility room until I was 22. It seemed easier than mentioning that most of my wages from the hardware store vanished into household expenses. It seemed easier than saying, plainly, that I had never once felt like a daughter. But I didn't leave. Not for years. Partly because I had nowhere credible to go. Partly because I clung, long past reason, to the hope that things might shift. And partly because of one person who made the house survivable, Helen's mother, a small, silver-haired woman named Ruth, who lived in the converted cottage behind the main property. Ruth was different from the rest of them in ways I couldn't fully articulate as a child but felt completely. She asked about my dreams. She remembered my birthday without being reminded. When she looked at me, there was no calculation in her eyes, no ledger being silently tallied. She simply saw me. One afternoon when I was 24, she took my hand across the kitchen table in her cottage. Her eyes had gone glassy in a way that alarmed me. "You've always deserved better than what they've given you," she said. I tried to deflect with a light laugh. "Better than what?" She didn't answer immediately. She looked toward the main house, then back at me, and when she spoke again, her voice was soft but deliberate, the voice of someone leaving instructions. "Remember this. The people who have spent the most time telling you who you are often have the least right to define you." I didn't understand it fully at the time. I stored it away the way you store something fragile, carefully, in a place where it won't get broken. Years later, those words came back to me again and again like a tide. Ruth passed away when I was 26. Without her, the property became colder in ways that had nothing to do with weather. Daniel had moved to Chicago. Piper had married and relocated. Yet I remained, orbiting the edges of everyone else's lives, useful and present and entirely unacknowledged as a person with my own interior world. By 30, I had stopped anticipating fairness. I had channeled what was left of my energy into volunteering, local food drives, elderly care coordination, community organizations. Helping others gave me a sense of purpose that the Callahan household never did. It reminded me that kindness was real, that it existed somewhere in the world, even if it had been largely rationed in my own life. I wasn't searching for anything that October. I wasn't expecting anything extraordinary. I was simply a woman trying to build a meaningful life on uncertain ground. Then the charity gala invitation arrived. The event was an international humanitarian summit being held at a grand historic hotel in Chicago, overlooking the river. The guest of honor was King Aldrich of Esfeld, a small constitutional monarchy in Northern Europe that most Americans couldn't locate on a map, but whose king had spent decades distinguished by his work in children's welfare, disaster relief, and global education initiatives. At 78, he carried the kind of quiet authority that doesn't need to announce itself. I signed up to volunteer without giving it any particular thought. It was the kind of event I always signed up for, something useful to do, somewhere to be, work that moved in one direction and had a clear beginning and end. Those were the things I sought out. They were the opposite of my childhood. The afternoon before the gala was spent in the familiar rhythms of event preparation, setting tables, arranging name cards, organizing service stations. The hotel staff treated us volunteers with a particular combination of attitude and mild condescension that I recognized from years of similar work. We were useful but temporary. I had no objection to that arrangement. I stood at one point near a tall window, as the city skyline caught the last amber light of the afternoon, and thought, as I sometimes did, that beauty had a way of persisting regardless of context. The river below was moving dark and steady. Somewhere across it, 1,000 ordinary lives were in progress, people finishing work and beginning evenings, people making small decisions that would or wouldn't matter, people carrying their histories invisibly, the way everyone does. Another volunteer appeared beside me. Nervous? She asked. Slightly, I admitted. She grinned. Same, my strategy is, carry the tray, keep the smile, don't spill. That had been essentially my life strategy for 3 decades. I figured I was qualified. When guests began arriving that evening, the ballroom filled quickly with the distinctive hum of powerful people at ease, the particular music of money and influence in conversation. Camera crews stationed near the entrance. Security personnel positioned throughout the room with practiced invisibility. Everyone waited for the king. He arrived around 9 o'clock. The room stood. Applause rolled across the marble floors and up to the chandeliers. I glanced toward the entrance and saw a man who looked older than his televised appearances suggested, not diminished, not weak, but carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who has borne enormous responsibility for a very long time. There was something in that I found unexpectedly moving. Power had not made him easy. He looked like someone who had spent a long time working at something that mattered to him and found that the work never actually finished. The evening proceeded in its appointed rhythm. Speeches, presentations, donations announced to warm applause. I moved through the room with my tray, refilling glasses, clearing plates, invisible in the useful way that service staff are always invisible at these events. It was honest work and I was good at it. Then, near the head table, it happened. A guest stepped backward unexpectedly. I shifted my weight and reached to correct my balance, and as I extended my arm, my sleeve pulled several inches up my forearm, exposing my left wrist. The scar had been there my entire life. A pale crescent-shaped mark, barely raised, unremarkable to me in every way. I had stopped noticing it years ago the way you stop noticing a piece of furniture that's always occupied the same corner of the room. But King Aldrich noticed it. I watched the transformation cross his face in real time, a rapid, involuntary sequence of confusion, recognition, and something that looked almost like fear, before the crystal glass slipped from his fingers and struck the marble with that sharp, shattering crack that silenced the entire room. He rose from his chair slowly, his eyes never leaving my wrist. The security detail moved. He raised one hand and they stopped. The ballroom held its breath. He stepped toward me. His chief advisor appeared at his elbow. The king ignored him completely, moving forward until he was close enough that I could see the tears forming at the edges of his eyes, an old man looking at something he had stopped allowing himself to believe he would ever see. "That scar," he said, his voice barely carrying. Then very quietly, "What is your full name?" My heart was pounding so loudly, I was surprised the microphones didn't pick it up. "Nora Callahan." Something shifted in his expression, a deepening of the shock. "No," he shook his head as if correcting a mistake in a document. "That can't be right." I stood completely still. "I'm sorry." He looked at me for a long moment. "How old are you?" 30. The color left his face as completely as if someone had turned off a light behind his eyes. The woman seated at his table reached for the tablecloth and gripped it. "Have you had that scar since birth?" The question came out with a tremor in it. "Yes," I said, because it was the only answer I had ever been given. He closed his eyes, one breath, then he opened them again. "Miss Callahan," he said, with a formality that seemed to cost him something, "I need to speak with you privately." The ballroom erupted behind us. The conference room upstairs was quiet and aggressively corporate, a long table, leather chairs, a window overlooking the river 2 floors below. The king sat across from me with his chief advisor, 2 attorneys, and a security officer. I sat on my side of the table and tried very hard not to look as completely unmoored as I felt. For a long moment, the king simply looked at me, not studying me exactly, recognizing me, the way you look at someone you thought you'd never see again. "Do you know anything about your biological parents?" he finally asked. "Nothing," I said. "The family that raised me said the records weren't available, that I'd been abandoned." Something tightened in his jaw. His advisors exchanged a look. "There was a child," he said carefully, as though each word needed to be handled gently. "A little girl, 30 years ago during a period of severe political violence in my country." He paused. "She disappeared. We searched for a very long time." Another pause. "We eventually stopped." I sat very still. "That scar appears in the child's confidential medical records," he said. "Documented at birth, a congenital mark, crescent-shaped, left wrist." I couldn't find language. "I am not telling you I know what the truth is," he said, reading something in my expression. "I am telling you there is a possibility I cannot ignore." "A possibility of what?" My voice came out smaller than I intended. He held my gaze, and in his eyes I saw 30 years of grief condensed into a single sentence. "I believe you may not be Nora Callahan at all." I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my hotel room watching Chicago's lights shimmer on the river until the sky turned gray and the city reassembled itself into morning, and I kept returning to those words the way a tongue returns to a loose tooth, compulsively, unable to leave it alone. "I believe you may not be Nora Callahan at all." Some part of me recognized the absurdity. Royalty, stolen identities. It belonged in a film, not in the life of a woman who had spent last Tuesday cleaning her adoptive mother's gutters. And yet, there had always been questions I was never permitted to ask. No hospital photographs, no birth stories, no details about what had existed before the Callahans claimed me. Whenever I'd pressed, Helen always gave the same sealed answer. "You were abandoned, full stop." Conversation over. I had learned, eventually, not to push. Now I wondered if that had been precisely the point. 3 days later, I agreed to DNA testing. The procedure itself was almost anticlimactic. Paperwork, a cheek swab, clinical fluorescent lighting. Nothing about it felt commensurate with the scale of what it might reveal. While the testing was underway, investigators began working through the available records. These were professionals who had handled sensitive cases involving missing persons, financial fraud, and international legal matters. They were not easy to surprise. Within days, they were surprised. What they found almost immediately was the first concrete indication that something had been deliberately obscured. There were no proper adoption records, not misfiled, not lost, simply absent, no court documentation, no finalized proceedings, no legal trail establishing how I had come to live with the Callahans at all. Then came the financial records. Large, regular deposits had been made to Gerald Callahan's account beginning in my infancy. The amounts were substantial, far beyond anything his business could account for. The payments had continued for years with mechanical consistency, and then, abruptly, stopped, as if whoever had been sending them had given up waiting for contact that never came. I drove back to Peoria. When Helen opened the front door, she looked surprised in a way that told me she'd already heard something was happening. "We need to talk," I said, stepping inside. Her expression sealed immediately, the way a room seals when someone opens a door against the wind. "Where did I come from?" I asked. Silence. "Show me the adoption papers." More silence, and in that silence, the answer I had been waiting 30 years for. Gerald appeared from the kitchen. His jaw set the moment he saw my face. "Some things," he said quietly, "are better left alone." I looked at him, this man I had cooked breakfast for, whose laundry I had folded, whose hardware store I had worked in for wages that somehow evaporated into household expenses, and I felt something shift in me that had been stuck for 30 years. "No," I said, "I don't think that's true anymore." I left without another word. For the first time in my life, they were the ones who looked frightened. The DNA results arrived 2 weeks later. I sat in a private room at the Esveld consulate in Chicago, surrounded by the king, his legal team, a genetics specialist, and a silence so complete you could hear the ventilation system breathing. Nobody in that room looked relaxed, and that alone told me everything. The specialist set a folder on the table. She looked at me directly. The results are conclusive. Her voice was measured, careful. Your DNA establishes a direct biological relationship to the royal family of Esveld. The king lowered his head. Specifically, the specialist continued, you are the biological granddaughter of Prince Edmund of Esveld. I had learned about Prince Edmund during the weeks of investigation. The king's younger brother, a widely admired figure known for his humanitarian work, his warmth, his young family. He had been killed 30 years earlier during a violent political attack, an organized assault that had also repeatedly claimed the life of his infant daughter. Reportedly. The king looked up at me, his eyes were full. For 30 years, he began and had to stop. He pressed his lips together, started again. For 30 years, we believed you were gone. I don't know exactly when I started crying. I became aware of tears on my face the way you become aware of rain, gradually, then all at once. Not because of titles or bloodlines, not because of what it meant materially, but because someone, this man sitting across from me with grief and relief written equally across his face, had spent 30 years looking for me. While the people raising me had spent those same 30 years telling me nobody wanted me. That specific irony broke something open that I hadn't known was still sealed. The king reached into his jacket pocket and produced a photograph. Old, slightly faded, carefully preserved. A young couple stood together holding an infant, my father's eyes, my mother's smile, and on the baby's left wrist, a small white bandage placed precisely over the location of my scar. We sat together in that conference room and wept, an old king and a 30-year-old woman, crying over 30 years that couldn't be returned. Then came the final layer of the truth, the one that transformed grief into something colder. Investigators had uncovered confidential records from 3 decades earlier documenting an emergency arrangement. In the chaos following Prince Edmund's death, a trusted intermediary had placed me with the Callahans for short-term protection. It was never meant to be permanent. Financial support had been arranged and transferred. Instructions had been explicit. Keep the child safe. Maintain communication. Prepare for eventual return. None of that had happened. Instead, the Callahans had accepted the payments, severed contact, relocated, and rebuilt their lives around the story of having generously rescued an abandoned infant. They had raised me as their burden, while cashing the checks meant to give me a future. They had spent decades performing sacrifice for public admiration, while privately receiving compensation for their trouble. For 30 years, I had believed I was unwanted. The truth was that I had been taken. Nobody tells you that vindication is exhausting. People assume that when the truth finally surfaces after 30 years, something clicks into place and the story becomes a fairy tale. It doesn't work that way. The revelation of what had been done to me didn't erase the 30 years. It just reframed them, which in some ways made the accounting more painful, not less. Now I could see exactly what had been stolen. Now the inventory was specific. A month after the DNA confirmation, I traveled to Esveld for the first time. I had spent the weeks between the confirmation and the trip in a strange suspension, not grief exactly, not joy exactly, but a kind of sustained disorientation, the feeling of having had the floor replaced beneath you while you were standing on it. The Callahans had been notified through legal channels. Investigators were continuing their work. Media requests had begun arriving, which I declined uniformly. The king had been patient, giving me time to process before making any decisions about what came next. What helped most, unexpectedly, was the foundation work. Even in those early weeks, before it had a formal structure, I was responding to letters and connecting with organizations. The activity kept me grounded in something concrete and purposeful at a time when my own sense of self had become genuinely uncertain. I could look at a specific young person in a specific difficult situation and know what kind of help might make a difference. That knowledge felt solid in a way that nothing else did. The flight to Esveld was long. I spent most of it looking out at cloud formations over the Atlantic and thinking about my father, a man I had never met and could not remember, a man who had apparently died trying to protect what he believed in, a man whose daughter had spent 30 years being told she was a burden rather than a legacy. I tried to hold both of those realities at once. I wasn't always able to. The royal estate surprised me. I had constructed some version of it in my imagination, grand, austere, visually overwhelming, but much of it simply felt like a place where people lived and worked. Historic buildings with worn stone steps, gardens turning toward autumn, offices and libraries and ordinary people moving through ordinary days. The scale was significant, yes, but what struck me most wasn't the architecture but the atmosphere. A place where something serious was being done, carefully, by people who understood its weight. What struck me most was the faces. People looked at me with something I wasn't accustomed to, uncomplicated warmth, not pity, not the particular evaluating attention of someone deciding how much of your story they believe. Simply warmth, as if my presence here resolved something for them too, as if I were completing a circuit that had been open for 30 years. King Aldrich personally walked me through rooms filled with photographs of my biological family, my father as a young man, my mother laughing at something off camera, generations of faces I shared bones with but had never known. One afternoon we sat together in a quiet study, watching the grounds go golden in the late afternoon light. "You have every right to be angry," he said. "I am," I told him, "more than I've admitted." He was quiet for a moment, then, "I've learned something about justice over the years. Justice and revenge often begin in the same place." He paused, "but they very rarely end in the same one." I carried that with me. Back in America, the investigation continued expanding. What emerged was worse than anticipated. Every payment sent for my care had been meticulously documented across decades. The total, calculated against its intended purpose, was staggering. Money designated for my education, my healthcare, my long-term financial security. Instead, it had funded Daniel's truck, Piper's arts programs, family vacations, home renovations. The full cost of a comfortable middle-class life, bankrolled by funds that had been meant for me and spent on everyone except me. The hypocrisy was what I couldn't stop returning to. Not the money itself, though the money was real and the theft was real, but the performance that had run alongside it. The decades of public virtue. The grateful adopted girl used as evidence of their goodness. The story told and retold at every pancake breakfast and church picnic, the story in which they were generous and I was lucky. The records said something different. The records said they had been paid. When the story reached the media, it moved fast. I hated the attention in ways I hadn't anticipated. Reporters wanted drama. They wanted a villain and a princess and a satisfying narrative arc. What they had difficulty understanding was that this wasn't content. This was my life. These were my 30 years. But the public's attention had a consequence neither the Callahans nor I could fully control. Their reputation, built across 3 decades of meticulous community performance, began collapsing with the particular swiftness of things that were never as solid as they appeared. Then came the meeting. The conference room in Chicago felt heavy from the moment everyone entered. The king was present, along with attorneys and investigators. Gerald and Helen arrived with their own legal representation. Daniel and Piper sat along the far wall, both of them looking like people who hadn't slept well in some time. Gerald still carried himself with the same confidence I had watched my entire life. The confidence of a man who believes his ability to explain things has never failed him and won't start now. Helen kept her eyes down. The investigators presented the evidence methodically. Bank records, correspondence, transfer documentation, decades of transactions, assembled into a timeline that left very little room for interpretation. The room grew quieter with each page turned. Gerald shifted in his seat. Finally, he spoke. "I don't understand why we're being treated like criminals." His voice had found its register, reasonable, slightly aggrieved, the voice he used when he felt misjudged. "We raised her. We fed her. We provided a home." Nobody responded. He pressed forward. Everything she is, everything she has, exists because of what we gave her. Then he looked directly at me. I looked back, and I felt, to my own surprise, not rage, not the white-hot fury I had imagined I would feel in this moment, but something quieter. A kind of profound sadness at watching a man double down on a story, even with its ruins spread across the table in front of him. King Aldrich reached for a folder. He opened it carefully and began reading, not theatrically, not with any performance of anger, simply reading facts aloud, one after another in a steady, unhurried voice. Payment designations, transfer amounts, stated purposes, educational fund, healthcare provision, future savings allocation, housing supplement. Dozens of line items, then more. The room became progressively more still. When he finished, he closed the folder. Then he asked a single question, quietly, almost gently. If this child had been your own daughter, would you have treated her this way? The silence that followed was the most complete I have ever experienced. Gerald looked at the table. Helen began crying, not performatively, not the practiced grief I had watched her deploy at church socials, but something smaller and uglier and more honest. Daniel stared at his hands. Piper pressed her fingers to her mouth. There was no answer, not because the question was unfair, because the answer was obvious and everyone in the room knew it, including them. I had expected this moment to feel like victory. Instead, I felt something I can only describe as fatigue, a bone-deep exhaustion, as if the anger I had been quietly carrying for 30 years had finally put itself down, and I was only now feeling how much it had weighed. The Callahans left the room without looking at me, not once. For several weeks after the confrontation, I kept mostly to myself. Not hiding, not ashamed, just very quiet in the way that follows an enormous noise. For 3 decades, my identity had been shaped entirely by other people's decisions and other people's stories. Now those stories had been dismantled, and I was standing in the space where they had been, trying to understand what I wanted to put there instead. The world seemed to expect a transformation, a princess emerging from the wreckage. What I actually experienced was more disorienting than that. I woke up every morning still feeling like the woman who had learned to fold laundry before breakfast, and I couldn't quite locate the line between who I had survived as and who I was supposed to become. Then Rebecca Piper, I kept reminding myself, though I still thought of her by the name I'd known, sent a message. Short, 3 words, can we talk? I stared at it for a long time before putting my phone away. More messages followed over the next several days. From her, from Daniel, eventually from Helen. The tone of each was different, some apologetic, some explanatory, some simply asking for a chance. For years I had imagined what it would feel like to receive these messages. I had imagined it as triumphant. What it actually felt like was sad. Because an apology, however genuine, cannot reconstruct a birthday that never happened. Regret cannot restore the years. No amount of belated acknowledgement can give back the grandmother who died without ever being able to tell me the full truth she clearly knew. I met Piper first. We sat in a coffee shop on a November afternoon, the kind of gray midweek day that discourages performance. I was jealous of you, she said, which was so far from what I'd expected that I almost laughed. Jealous? She nodded slowly. You were always stronger than any of us, more resilient, more real. Tears came. I watched what they did to you and I said nothing, and I have to live with that. We talked for nearly 2 hours. Nothing was resolved, that was never going to happen over coffee. But something important passed between us. The truth, spoken plainly, in a room where no performance was required. My conversation with Daniel was harder. He deflected more, explained more, accepted less. But even he reached a place, eventually, where the explanations ran out. We should have helped you, he said finally, simply, without elaboration. Late and inadequate and true. As winter arrived, I found my thoughts shifting from the past toward the question of what came next. The King's legal team had presented me with options. The financial evidence against the Callahans was substantial. I could pursue civil claims, recover damages, seek extensive compensation. The attorneys used phrases like strong position and favorable outcome with barely contained enthusiasm. I listened carefully, and then I sat with it. Not because the Callahans didn't deserve consequences. They did, and those consequences were already arriving in the form the king had described, not through courtrooms necessarily, but through truth. Their reputation, the most precious thing they had built and protected and polished for 3 decades, had not survived contact with the documented reality of what they'd done. In their community, among people who had praised them, in the eyes of their own children. That erosion was happening with or without my legal intervention, and it would continue. What I kept asking myself was different. Did I want the rest of my life to be organized around them? One afternoon during a walk through the winter grounds of the estate in Esfeld, King Aldrich asked me what I wanted. Not what I was entitled to, not what the attorneys thought I could recover. What I, Nora, or whatever my name actually was, wanted. I told him I'd never been asked that question before. I'm asking it now, he said simply. I thought about it honestly for the first time. I want peace, I said. I want to stop carrying this. He was quiet for a moment. Then, many people believe revenge will heal them. It can satisfy sometimes. But healing is different. Healing is something you have to build separately. I thought about Ruth, Helen's mother, the woman who had been the only genuinely kind presence in my childhood. I thought about what she had told me in her cottage kitchen. The people who spend the most time telling you who you are often have the least right to define you. For 30 years, the Callahans had been my definition. The rescued one, the black sheep, the burden turned presentable, the girl who should have been grateful. What if I simply stopped accepting the definition? What if who I was had never actually been theirs to assign? That thought felt like a window, opening in a room that had been sealed for a very long time. The phone call from Helen came on a gray Sunday morning in early spring. I almost didn't answer. I sat watching my phone ring, her name on the screen, and I made the decision to pick it up the way you make any small decision that turns out to matter. Her voice sounded different, older, smaller, like something structural had shifted inside it. Nora, a pause. Then the sound of someone crying, not the theatrical grief I'd grown up watching her perform, but something raw and unguarded that I'd never heard from her before. I know this doesn't fix anything, she said. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I just need you to know that I'm sorry, that I know what we did was wrong. A long pause. We should have loved you better. 5 words. We should have loved you better. I closed my eyes. Because those words, of all the things said in all the rooms and conversations and legal proceedings of the past year, hit with a weight that nothing else had. Not because they changed what had happened. Because for the first time, after 30 years, she was simply telling the truth. We met a few weeks later, not as mother and daughter, not as adversaries, just as 2 people who had shared a difficult history and were trying to navigate towards something livable. We didn't resolve everything. Some damage exists past the reach of resolution. But something happened in that conversation that I hadn't anticipated. Responsibility was claimed. Not partially, not conditionally, just claimed. I've thought a lot about forgiveness since then, because people misunderstand it almost universally. Forgiveness is not the erasure of what happened. It is not the rehabilitation of the people who caused harm. It is not forgetting, or minimizing, or surrendering the truth of your own experience. Forgiveness is a decision about what you carry. It is the choice not to let bitterness write the final chapter of your story. I made that choice, not for Helen or Gerald, for myself. Because I had spent 30 years living in a story someone else had written for me, and I was not willing to let them write the ending too. There is a version of this story that ends in a courtroom. The investigators gave me every tool I needed to pursue that version. The financial documentation alone was extensive enough to sustain a serious legal action. One of the attorneys told me, with visible enthusiasm, that she hadn't seen evidence this clean in years. I thought about it carefully. I thought about what it would mean to spend the next several years of my life in legal proceedings with the Callahans, what it would cost in time and attention and emotional endurance, what it would mean to have that fight become the organizing center of my existence. I had already given them 30 years. I wasn't willing to give them any more. What I wanted was not compensation. What I wanted was what I had always wanted, without knowing how to name it, to be seen and to be free. The truth had accomplished both. Gerald and Helen Callahan would spend the rest of their lives in a community that now knew what they had done. Their church, their neighbors, their civic organizations, all of it reconfigured around a new understanding of who they were. Not monsters, necessarily, but not the saints they had performed being for 30 years either. Something more complicated and less flattering than that. People who had chosen convenience over conscience, who had accepted money in exchange for a child's future and spent it on their own comfort, and who had never once, in 30 years, acknowledged the cost. That accounting didn't require my participation. It was happening on its own. A year after the charity gala, I returned to the same hotel in Chicago. The ballroom looked exactly as I remembered it. The chandeliers, the marble floor, the river beyond the tall windows catching the autumn light. So much had changed. The room was unchanged. There's something important in that combination. I stood for a moment near the place where the king's glass had fallen, that small, specific location on the ballroom floor where a scar was seen, and a question was asked, and 30 years of lies began to come apart at the seams. A foundation now carries my name. It began simply, without ceremony or grand announcement. A practical support structure for children aging through difficult family situations, foster children, adopted children, young people who had been tolerated rather than loved, who had carried burdens they never deserved to carry. Scholarships, counseling access, housing assistance, mentorship programs. The practical architecture of a second chance. The idea came directly from my own experience, from the specific and nameable gaps I had lived inside. I thought about what would have changed my trajectory if it had been available to me. Not charity in the performance sense, not the public gesture of taking in a child and then turning her into evidence of your goodness, but genuine structural support. A scholarship that actually reached the student it was intended for. A counselor who could help a teenager understand that what was happening at home wasn't normal and wasn't her fault. A mentor who could say, plainly and without agenda, "You are worth more than this." I thought about every letter that arrived after the story became public. The ones from people in their 60s and 70s, describing childhoods that sounded like mine in unexpected detail. The ones from young adults in their 20s, who were still untangling the specific damage of growing up in households where they were obligations rather than beloved people. The ones from people who had never told anyone their story before and chose, for whatever reason, to tell it to me. Every single one of those letters contained some version of the same core revelation. They had assumed their experience was singular. They had assumed that what happened in their households was too strange or too shameful or too unlikely to be shared, because surely nobody else would understand. The response exceeded everything I'd imagined. Letters arrived from across the country, from people in their 70s and 80s, from young adults, from people in places I'd never been, all of them carrying variations of the same story. And again, one sentence appeared in letter after letter. I thought I was the only one. Those words affected me every time because I knew exactly what they meant. I had thought the same thing for 30 years. The isolation of believing your particular suffering was uniquely yours, that nobody else would recognize it, that speaking it aloud would only confirm what you feared most, that you were too strange, too complicated, too damaged to be understood. You are not the only one. I know that now with a certainty nothing can touch. King Aldrich told me something once that I return to often. We were walking through the winter gardens at the estate, bare trees and stone pathways, and the kind of cold that clarifies everything. Blood may tell you something about where you came from, he said, but character is what determines who you become. He paused, and I waited, because I had learned that he was a man who meant everything he said and never rushed what deserved time. Your father had that quality, he said after a moment. Edmund, he was the kindest person I've ever known, and not in the passive sense, not kindness as absence of cruelty, active kindness. Kindness that cost him something, he chose it anyway. The old man's voice tightened slightly. You are very much his daughter. I held those words for a long time afterward, not because they gave me something I hadn't had, but because they named something I had always carried without knowing what to call it. All those years of helping neighbors when I had nothing to spare. All those hours volunteering at organizations that offered nothing in return. The instinct to care for Ruth when no one else was paying attention to a fading old woman in a cottage. All of that, it turned out, was inheritance. Just not the kind anyone could have predicted. I think that's true. I think it might be the truest thing in this entire story. For 30 years I was told I was the leftover, the outsider, the lucky rescued child who should never stop being grateful. Those labels weren't descriptions of me. They were descriptions of what the people who spoke them needed me to be. Labels are often like that. They tell you more about the person assigning them than the person receiving them. What was actually mine, what had always been mine, before I knew any of this, before a king dropped a glass, and a scar changed everything, was my character. My capacity for kindness in an unkind environment. My refusal to become cruel in response to cruelty. My ability to see dignity in others precisely because I knew what it felt like to have mine consistently overlooked. Those things carried me through 30 years. They carry me still. There is something I've come to understand about resilience that nobody told me when I needed to hear it. Resilience is not the absence of damage. It is not the performance of being fine when you are not fine. It is something quieter and more stubborn than that. It is simply the daily decision to remain oriented toward life rather than against it. To keep building even when the foundation keeps shifting. To keep reaching for kindness, even when the available evidence suggests that kindness is naive. I spent 30 years practicing that orientation without knowing that's what I was doing. Ruth saw it. She tried to name it for me in the only way available to her, in cryptic sentences from a kitchen table, in the warmth of her attention, in the simple revolutionary act of asking what I wanted, and then actually listening to the answer. She was right about all of it. She just couldn't tell me the whole truth, and I've had to make peace with that. She did what she could within the constraints she was given. Most of us do. If you have ever been made to feel like a burden, an afterthought, a person whose value depends entirely on someone else's willingness to assign it, I want you to hear this clearly. The people who told you who you were working from an incomplete map, a map drawn for their own navigation, not yours, a map that placed them at the center and arranged everything else around the convenience of that position. That map was never accurate. It was never meant to be. Your worth was never theirs to grant. It was always yours. It was yours on the days they reminded you to be grateful, and it was yours on the days they forgot you existed, and it was yours in the converted laundry room and at the hardware store counter, and in every moment when you kept going despite every signal telling you there was no point in continuing. It has always been yours. Nothing that was done to you changed that. Nothing that was said about you could touch it. Sometimes the loudest voices in your life are the ones with the least authority over your story. Don't let them write it. Don't let them finish it. Pick up the pen yourself. If this story moved you in any way, consider the people in your own life who might be carrying quiet weights. A moment of genuine acknowledgement, a word chosen with care, a willingness to see someone who is trying not to be seen. These cost very little and mean more than most of us ever know. Small acts of real attention leave longer marks than grand gestures ever will. Pass it on.